He was 19 years old when the cell door slammed shut for the final time. No parole hearing scheduled. No release date circled on any calendar. Just concrete walls and the slow, suffocating realization that this was forever. In America right now, over 56,000 people are serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. They will die behind bars. Many were teenagers when they entered. Some have been locked up longer than they've been alive on the outside. This isn't death row. There's no execution date. Just decades of the same routine, the same faces, the same yard, until their hearts stop beating in a prison hospital bed or a cell bunk. Florida alone holds more than 13,600 people serving life without parole, nearly a quarter of the entire nation's total. 44% of them weren't even convicted of murder. Louisiana's Angola State Penitentiary has 2 cemeteries now. The first one's full. They had to build a second because so many men sentenced to life are dying there. 73% of Angola's lifers are black men. Many arrived as teenagers in the 1970s and 80s. They're in their 60s and 70s now, if they're still alive. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. The United States holds 40% of the world's entire life sentence prison population despite having only 4% of the world's people. We incarcerate more people for life than some countries incarcerate total. One man spent 66 years in Angola. Arrested at 15. Died at 81, still behind the same razor wire fences. Another served from age 17 until he was 75. Nearly 6 decades watching the world change through television screens and letters that arrived less and less frequently as everyone he knew on the outside grew old or died. These are the stories that will haunt you. Not because of what these men did, though their crimes were real, documented, and caused genuine harm, but because of what happens to a human being when you tell them at 16, at 19, at 21, you will never leave this place. What you become when hope is taken away. When rehabilitation means nothing because there's no one to rehabilitate you for. When you know with absolute certainty that you will die in 6x8 cell. This is about life without end. About men who arrived as boys and became grandfathers in prison. About the ones who teach themselves law to help others. Who run hospice programs caring for fellow inmates dying of old age, who mentor younger prisoners knowing they'll never walk free themselves. The sentences were meant to be the harshest punishment short of death. But decades later, looking at the men they've become, at the programs they've built, at the remorse many carry, the question becomes more complicated. Is this justice? Or is this something else entirely? You're about to meet the men locked up for life in America's most notorious prisons. Their crimes, their transformations, and the system that says no matter who you become, you'll die where you are. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The youngest lifers. Kenneth Young was 16 years old when he participated in an armed robbery in Louisiana that left one person dead. He didn't pull the trigger. But under Louisiana's felony murder rule, it didn't matter. Everyone involved in a felony that results in death can be charged with murder. Kenneth was sentenced to life without parole in 1981. He's 60 now. He's been locked up for 44 years, nearly 3 times longer than he was alive on the outside. Across America, approximately 2,700 people are currently serving life without parole for crimes they committed as juveniles. The Supreme Court ruled in 2012 that mandatory life without parole for juveniles violates the 8th Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. But the ruling wasn't retroactive for everyone. Many sentenced before 2012 remain in prison with no release date. Pennsylvania holds the highest number of juvenile lifers, more than 500 people who were children when they were sentenced to die in prison. Some were 14, 15, 16 years old when judges handed down sentences that ended any possibility of freedom. At Angola, there's a man who arrived at 17 after being convicted of second-degree murder. He's in his 60s now. He learned to read in prison, taught himself law. He helps other inmates file appeals, knowing his own case is closed. No appeals left. No hearing scheduled. The Supreme Court's 2012 decision in Miller v. Alabama said children are different. Their brains aren't fully developed. They're more susceptible to peer pressure, more likely to act impulsively, less able to consider long-term consequences. The court said they deserve a chance at rehabilitation. But thousands of juvenile lifers sentenced before that ruling remain locked up. Some states have held resentencing hearings. Others haven't. Louisiana took years to begin reviewing cases. Many of those reviews resulted in the same sentence: life without parole. There's a documented case of a man who was 15 when he and 3 others robbed a convenience store in Philadelphia in 1971. The store owner was killed. All 4 teenagers were convicted of felony murder. All 4 received life without parole. One of them, after serving 46 years, was finally released in 2017 at age 61. He'd spent his entire adult life behind bars for a crime committed when he was a sophomore in high school. The other 3 are still inside. Juvenile lifers describe a particular kind of psychological torture. You enter as a child. You're surrounded by adult prisoners who see you as prey. You have to learn prison politics fast, or you won't survive. You become hard because softness gets you killed. By the time you're in your 20s, you've been in prison longer than you were free. You've never had a legal drink, never voted, never held a job, never paid rent, never had an adult relationship. By your 30s, everyone you knew on the outside has moved on. Your parents are aging. Your siblings have families you'll never meet. Former friends stopped writing years ago. You exist in a frozen moment. The worst thing you ever did defines you forever. Even as you change, mature, grow into someone completely different from that terrified teenager. Court documents from juvenile lifer cases reveal a pattern. Many came from neighborhoods devastated by the crack epidemic of the 1980s. Many witnessed extreme violence as children. Many had absent parents. Some incarcerated themselves. Many were functionally illiterate when they entered prison. The crimes they committed were real and devastating. But the question courts now wrestle with is whether a child's worst moment should determine their entire existence. In 2016, the Supreme Court ruled in Montgomery v. Louisiana that the Miller decision should be applied retroactively. States had to review juvenile lifer cases. But the court didn't ban life without parole for juveniles entirely. It just said it couldn't be automatic. Judges had to consider the individual circumstances. The result? Many juvenile lifers were resentenced to life without parole again. The hearings became formalities. Prosecutors argued these were the worst of the worst offenders. Judges agreed. The sentences stood. At California's Pelican Bay State Prison, there's a man who was 16 when he participated in a drive-by shooting that killed a bystander. He's 49 now. He spent 33 years in solitary confinement, more than 2 decades in a cell the size of a parking space, alone for 23 hours a day. His original sentence was life without parole. His conditions of confinement, many would argue, amount to torture. He's written poetry, taught himself multiple languages, corresponds with law students. He's a completely different person than the terrified gang member who entered prison at 16. But the law doesn't care who you become. It only cares who you were. The human brain doesn't fully develop until age 25. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, planning, considering consequences, is the last part to mature. Neuroscience supports what the Supreme Court acknowledged. Children literally think differently than adults. They're more reckless, more influenced by peers, less able to resist pressure. But American criminal justice has historically treated children as adults when the crime is serious enough. 13 states have no minimum age for trying children as adults. You could be 10 years old and face adult charges in some jurisdictions. By the time you're 14 or 15, prosecutors routinely seek adult sentences for serious violent crimes. The families of victims often oppose releasing juvenile lifers. At resentencing hearings, they testify about loved ones who never got a second chance. about lives cut short, about grief that never fades. Their pain is real and documented. The question isn't whether the original crime was serious. It always was. The question is whether a child who committed that crime should spend 70 or 80 years in prison for something they did at 15. Some juvenile lifers have been released after decades behind bars. Follow-up studies show remarkably low recidivism rates, less than 1% for those who serve 20 or more years for juvenile crimes. They're elderly by the time they're freed. They've spent more of their lives in prison than out. Many struggle to adapt to technology, social norms, a world that moved on without them. But they rarely reoffend. The data suggests that whatever danger they posed as teenagers has long since passed. Kenneth Young, the Louisiana man sentenced at 16, has been denied parole repeatedly during resentencing hearings. He's completed every educational program available. He's maintained a clean disciplinary record for decades. He's expressed remorse. Court psychologists evaluated him and found no evidence he poses a danger. It didn't matter. The parole board said life means life. He'll die in Angola, in his cell, or in the prison hospital. He'll be buried in the prison cemetery with hundreds of others who arrived young and never left. This is the American justice system's answer to children who commit serious crimes. Not rehabilitation, not redemption, just endless concrete and steel until death. The politics of death behind bars. In 1984, a man named Charles Dutton was sentenced to life without parole at Maryland Correctional Institution. He'd been involved in a fatal stabbing. He was 23 years old. The judge told him he would never breathe free air again. Dutton decided if he was going to die in prison, he wouldn't die ignorant. He taught himself to read using discarded newspapers. Then he started reading plays, Shakespeare, August Wilson, anything he could find in the prison library. He joined the prison theater program, discovered he had talent, started writing. Other inmates noticed the change in him. He became a mentor to younger prisoners, teaching literacy classes, running the theater group. But Maryland's life without parole sentence meant none of it mattered. There was no parole board to impress. No incentive for rehabilitation. The system had given up on him. Except Dutton's case caught national attention. Theater professionals from outside the prison saw his work. Advocacy groups took up his cause. After 16 years, in 1991, his sentence was commuted by Maryland's governor. He was released. Charles Dutton became a successful actor, director, and producer. He starred in television series, directed films, won awards, became one of the most prominent success stories of prison rehabilitation in American history. But his case was extraordinary. Out of tens of thousands of people serving life without parole, maybe a handful will ever receive clemency. The vast majority will die exactly where they are. The question that haunts prison reformers and families of the incarcerated is this: if someone like Charles Dutton can transform completely and contribute to society, how many others are locked away forever who might do the same if given the chance? At Louisiana State Penitentiary, the politics of death play out differently than in prisons with parole systems. When there's no hope of release, the only currency is respect and survival. Gang politics dominate. Racial segregation is informal but absolute. You align with your group or you're vulnerable. But something unexpected has emerged at Angola over the past 20 years. A hospice program run by prisoners. Because so many men are serving life sentences and dying in prison, Angola needed a way to care for the elderly and terminally ill. In 1997, the prison started training inmates to be hospice volunteers, lifers caring for other lifers in their final days. The program has been documented extensively. Prisoners who once committed violent crimes now sit vigil with dying men, holding their hands, reading to them, helping them die with dignity. Many of the hospice volunteers are serving life without parole themselves. They know they'll eventually be on those same deathbeds, cared for by other lifers. One hospice volunteer, a man serving life for murder, told researchers he'd sat with 17 men as they died. He said it gave him purpose, a way to atone, even if he'd never be free. He described holding a man's hand as he took his last breath, closing his eyes, preparing his body, praying over him. This is what happens when you warehouse humans for life. They find ways to create meaning, to build community, to care for each other because no one else will. The numbers tell a stark story. Life without parole sentences have increased 66% since 2003. Nearly 56,000 people are currently serving these sentences. The United States is one of only 6 countries that sentences people to life without parole for nonviolent crimes. In many states, drug offenses, robbery without injury, even certain fraud cases can result in life sentences under 3 strikes laws. At California's San Quentin State Prison, there's a man serving life without parole for his 3rd strike, stealing a pair of work gloves from a hardware store. His first 2 strikes were nonviolent burglaries committed when he was in his 20s and addicted to drugs. The gloves were worth $2.50. He's been locked up for 19 years and counting. The Supreme Court ruled in 2012 that life without parole for juvenile offenders violated the Constitution. But it's never extended that reasoning to nonviolent adult offenses. States can still sentence someone to die in prison for theft, fraud, or drug crimes. The political reality is simple. Tough on crime policies sell. District attorneys campaign on conviction rates. Governors fear appearing soft on crime. Parole boards face immense political pressure. When a released prisoner reoffends, it becomes a media scandal. But when someone who might have been safely released dies in prison, no one notices. At Florida State Prison, 73-year-old prisoners shuffle to the chow hall with walkers. Men in their 80s sit in wheelchairs in recreation yards, oxygen tanks beside them. They're not dangerous. They're geriatric. But they're serving life without parole for crimes committed 40 or 50 years ago. Maintaining elderly prisoners costs states enormous amounts. Healthcare for aging inmates runs 3 to 9 times higher than for younger prisoners. Florida spends an estimated $68,000 per year housing an elderly prisoner versus $20,000 for a younger one. Nationwide, the costs run into billions annually. Some states have created compassionate release programs for elderly or terminally ill prisoners. But the criteria are often so narrow that few qualify. Many require the prisoner to be so ill they'll die within months. Families argue that if someone is too sick to walk, they're too sick to be a danger to society. But prosecutors and victims' families often oppose these releases. They say the prisoner received a life sentence for a reason, that the punishment should mean something, that victims' families deserve to know the person who killed their loved one will never walk free. At Ohio's Mansfield Correctional Institution, a man named John was sentenced to life without parole for a murder committed during a robbery when he was 22. He's 68 now. He has advanced heart disease, diabetes, kidney failure. He requires dialysis 3 times a week at the prison medical facility. His attorney filed for compassionate release. Medical experts testified he had less than a year to live. The parole board denied the request. The prosecutor argued that the victim didn't get to die surrounded by family. John shouldn't either. 6 months later, John died in the prison hospital. The state had spent tens of thousands of dollars on his medical care in his final year. He died in handcuffs, guards present, away from his 3 children who'd been pleading for his release. These stories repeat across the country. Thousands of men and women aging and dying behind bars. Some maintain relationships with family. Most don't. Decades of prison visits take their toll. Children grow up and move away. Spouses divorce and remarry. Parents die. Eventually, the only people who remember you're alive are other prisoners. The psychological impact of life without parole has been documented in academic studies. Researchers describe a specific syndrome. The loss of hope creates a form of psychological death, even while the body continues functioning. Without a release date, without any goal to work toward, many prisoners simply exist. They go through the motions. Wake up, chow, yard, cell. Repeat for decades until they die. But others refuse that fate. They create purpose. They mentor younger prisoners. They write. They make art. They take college courses even though they'll never use the degrees. They fight legal battles on behalf of other inmates. They become jailhouse lawyers, paralegals, teachers, counselors. At Maryland's Jessup Correctional Institution, a man serving life without parole started a program teaching financial literacy to inmates. He figured even if he'd never be free, he could help others avoid the mistakes that led them to prison. Over 15 years, he taught hundreds of prisoners about budgeting, debt, credit, saving, skills they'd need on release that he'd never use himself. The politics of who deserves life without parole have shifted over decades. In the 1970s and 80s, during the crack epidemic and rising crime rates, states passed laws making life without parole mandatory for certain offenses. Politicians competed to be toughest on crime. Sentences lengthened. Parole was eliminated or severely restricted. Then crime rates dropped. The causes are debated: better policing, demographic changes, reduced lead exposure, economic factors. But by the 2000s, violent crime had fallen dramatically from its early 1990s peak. Yet the prisoners sentenced during the tough-on-crime era remained locked up. Laws changed slowly, if at all. The political will to release people, even those who'd served decades and posed minimal risk, didn't exist. At Pelican Bay, a man named Richard has been in solitary confinement for 32 years. He's serving life without parole for a murder committed at age 19 during a gang-related incident. For 3 decades, he's been alone in an 8x10 cell for 23 hours a day. The United Nations considers prolonged solitary confinement torture. Richard has filed lawsuit after lawsuit challenging his conditions. He's lost everyone. The courts say his housing assignment is an administrative decision, not a constitutional violation. He'll likely die in that cell. This is the politics of death behind bars. Once you're sentenced to life without parole, you cease to be a political concern. You're not a voter. You have no constituency. Your suffering is invisible. Your transformation is irrelevant. Unless you're Charles Dutton. Unless your case goes viral. Unless a documentary filmmaker or advocacy group takes interest. Unless a governor facing the end of their term decides to exercise clemency. For the other 55,999 people serving life without parole, there is no Hollywood ending. Just concrete and steel until the end. The 3 strikes that never miss. In 1994, California passed the most aggressive 3 strikes law in American history. The promise was simple: keep repeat offenders locked up forever. The reality became something else entirely. A man named Jerry Dwayne Williams stole a slice of pizza from a group of children on a pier in Redondo Beach. It was his 3rd strike. He got 25 years to life. He's still in prison. Another man, Gary Ewing, shoplifted 3 golf clubs worth $399 each from a pro shop. 3rd strike, 25 to life. The Supreme Court upheld his sentence in 2003, ruling it didn't constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Kevin Weber stole 4 chocolate chip cookies from a restaurant. 3rd strike, 25 to life. These aren't isolated cases. California alone has sentenced over 8,500 people to 25 years to life under 3 strikes laws. Nearly 3,000 of them, more than a third, had nonviolent 3rd strikes. Shoplifting, petty theft, drug possession, receiving stolen property. The law was sold to voters as targeting violent career criminals, convicted rapists, armed robbers, repeat violent offenders who kept victimizing communities. But the statute was written so broadly that any felony could trigger a life sentence if you had 2 prior serious or violent felonies on your record, even if those prior convictions were decades old. Even if you'd served your time, completed rehabilitation programs, stayed clean for years. One more felony, any felony, and you were done. At California State Prison, Corcoran, there's a man serving 25 to life for attempting to fill a fraudulent prescription for Vicodin. His 2 prior strikes were residential burglaries committed in the 1980s when he was addicted to drugs. He'd been clean for 6 years. Then he injured his back at a construction job, became dependent on painkillers, forged a prescription. 3rd strike. He's been locked up for 17 years. His daughters were 8 and 10 when he went to prison. They're adults now, with children of their own he's never met. The political climate that created 3 strikes laws was driven by fear and grief. In 1992, 18-year-old Kimber Reynolds was shot and killed during a robbery attempt in Fresno, California. Her father, Mike Reynolds, discovered that one of the men charged in his daughter's murder had been paroled just months earlier after serving half of his sentence for another violent crime. Reynolds was enraged. He drafted a ballot initiative: 3 strikes and you're out. If you committed 3 serious crimes, you'd go to prison for 25 years to life. No parole, no exceptions. He campaigned across California, telling Kimber's story, warning voters about repeat offenders being released to hurt more victims. Then 12-year-old Polly Klaas was kidnapped from a slumber party in Petaluma and murdered. Her killer, Richard Allen Davis, had an extensive violent criminal history. He'd been in and out of prison for kidnapping and assault. He was on parole when he took Polly. California voters were terrified. The media coverage was constant. Parents feared for their children. Politicians promised action. In 1994, 3 strikes passed with 72% approval. Other states rushed to copy California's law. By the end of the 1990s, 24 states had some version of 3 strikes legislation. The federal government passed its own 3 strikes law applying to federal crimes. But California's version was uniquely harsh. Other states required the 3rd strike to be violent. California's didn't. Any felony would do. The consequences were immediate. Prison populations exploded. Courts became backlogged because defendants facing life sentences had no incentive to plead guilty. They demanded trials. Prosecutors gained massive leverage in plea negotiations. Accept a lesser charge or risk a 3rd strike and die in prison. The law also created perverse incentives. Some defendants with 2 strikes stopped committing crimes, the intended effect, but others became more dangerous. If you're facing life in prison no matter what, why not resist arrest? Why not flee? Why not fight? The punishment can't get worse. At Pelican Bay, a man named Shane Taylor is serving 25 to life. His 3rd strike was stealing a car stereo. His prior strikes were robbery convictions from his early 20s when he was using methamphetamine. He got clean in prison, completed vocational training, was released after serving 7 years. He stayed clean for 4 years, got a job, had a son, then he relapsed, started using again, made desperate choices, broke into a car and stole a stereo to sell for drug money. Got caught. The prosecutor offered him a deal, plead guilty, take 12 years. Shane refused. He insisted he was high at the time, didn't form the intent required for grand theft. He demanded a trial. The jury convicted him in 40 minutes. The judge had no choice under the law. 25 years to life. Shane's son was 2 years old. He's 19 now. Shane has spent most of his sentence at Pelican Bay. He's been denied parole 3 times. The board tells him the same thing each hearing. The law is the law. The racial disparities in 3 strike sentencing are stark and documented. Black defendants are sentenced under 3 strikes laws at 12 times the rate of white defendants in California. Even when controlling for criminal history and offense severity, Black and Latino defendants receive 3 strikes sentences significantly more often than white defendants with identical records. Part of this reflects broader racial disparities in the criminal justice system. Black and Latino communities face heavier policing. Stop-and-frisk policies, gang injunctions, broken windows policing. These tactics concentrate arrests in minority neighborhoods. More arrests mean more prior convictions. More priors mean higher chances of 3 strike sentences. But studies also show discretion in charging decisions. Prosecutors decide whether to charge a crime as a felony or misdemeanor, whether to file strike priors, whether to offer a deal or demand a trial. That discretion, research consistently finds, is exercised more punitively against defendants of color. At San Quentin, approximately 40% of 3 strikes lifers are Black men, though Black people make up only 6% of California's population. Walk the yards and you see the result. Thousands of middle-aged and elderly Black and Latino men serving 25 to life for crimes like shoplifting, drug possession, petty theft. In 2012, California voters passed Proposition 36, reforming the 3 strikes law. Going forward, only serious or violent felonies could trigger a third strike. Nonviolent offenders already sentenced under the old law could petition for resentencing. Over 3,000 people were released as a result. Follow-up studies tracked them. The recidivism rate was astonishingly low. Only 20% were convicted of any new crime within 5 years. Just 1% committed new violent offenses. This data suggested what reformers have been arguing all along. Most three-strikes prisoners posed minimal public safety risk. They were aging. Many had aged out of crime anyway. Criminological research consistently shows that criminal behavior drops sharply after age 35. Locking them up forever accomplished nothing except filling prisons with elderly men at enormous cost. But Proposition 36 had limits. It didn't apply to people whose third strike was nonviolent, but who had certain prior convictions. Sex offenses, certain violent crimes from decades earlier. These prisoners remained ineligible for resentencing despite posing the same low statistical risk. At Salinas Valley State Prison, a man named Robert is serving 25 to life. His third strike was receiving stolen property, car parts worth $150. But his prior convictions include a robbery from 32 years ago when he was 19. Because of that old conviction, he's ineligible for resentencing under Prop 36. He's 56 now. He's been locked up for 19 years. He completed every rehabilitation program available, maintained a clean disciplinary record, received positive psychological evaluations. But the law says that robbery from 1990 makes him too dangerous. The stories repeat with maddening consistency. A man gets addicted to drugs as a teenager, commits crimes to feed the addiction, goes to prison, gets clean, gets released, stays clean for years, then relapses, commits a relatively minor crime, theft, fraud, drug possession, third strike, life sentence, or a man commits 2 violent crimes in his 20s during gang involvement, goes to prison, serves time, gets released at 30, leaves the gang, gets a job, starts a family. 10 years later, at 40, he makes a mistake, shoplifts, drives drunk, steals something minor. Third strike, 25 to life. The law treats these cases identically. It sees the prior convictions and the current felony and calculates life sentence. It doesn't consider time passed, doesn't weigh rehabilitation, doesn't account for age or changed circumstances. Three strikes laws embody a philosophy. Some people are irredeemable. They've proven through their actions that they'll keep offending. The only solution is permanent incapacitation. But the evidence doesn't support this. Most people age out of crime. Most people, given treatment and opportunity, can change. The recidivism data from Prop 36 releases proves this. Yet thousands remain locked up under the old law's harshest provisions. At California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo, there's a man named Frank serving 25 to life for stealing meat from a grocery store. His car contained $153 worth of steaks and chicken breasts. He walked out without paying. Security stopped him in the parking lot. Frank had 2 prior burglary convictions from the 1980s. He'd served 5 years combined, been out for 12 years, had a job at a body shop, was struggling financially, made a stupid, desperate choice. Third strike, 25 to life. Frank is 58 now. He served 14 years. He's gained 60 pounds, has diabetes and high blood pressure, requires multiple medications. The state spends approximately $50,000 annually housing and caring for him. His crime caused $153 in loss. The state has spent over $700,000 keeping him locked up. It will spend another $500,000 to $1 million more before he's eligible for parole at 72 years old. This is the mathematics of 3 strikes. Take people who commit relatively minor crimes. Multiply by decades of incarceration. Add medical costs that increase exponentially with age. The result is billions of dollars spent warehousing people who pose minimal threat. The victims of these policies aren't just the prisoners. Their families lose fathers, brothers, sons. Children grow up without parents. Communities lose workers and taxpayers. The state diverts resources from education, healthcare, infrastructure to fund prisons. And the original purpose, protecting public safety, is undermined when prisons overflow with nonviolent offenders while resources for policing, victim services, and mental health treatment are cut. But changing the laws requires political will. Admitting the policy was wrong, risking being labeled soft on crime, facing victims' families who believe the person who hurt them should stay locked up forever regardless of what they did or who they become. So the laws remain, and men continue serving life sentences for stealing pizza, for shoplifting golf clubs, for possessing small amounts of drugs. 3 strikes. You're out. Forever. The women nobody sees. In 2007, a woman named Sarah Cruzan was serving life without parole at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. She'd been sentenced at 17 for killing the man who'd been sex trafficking her since she was 13. The courts called it first-degree murder. Sarah called it survival. She was 31 years old when California passed sentencing reform, allowing juvenile offenders to petition for resentencing. Her case became a flashpoint in debates about sex trafficking, childhood trauma, and what justice means for girls who kill their abusers. After serving 19 years, Sarah was released in 2013. Her case revealed something the criminal justice system rarely acknowledges. The women serving life sentences often have vastly different stories than the men. Approximately 5,000 women are currently serving life sentences in American prisons. That's less than 10% of all lifers. But their pathways to life sentences follow distinct patterns that criminal justice researchers have extensively documented. Over 80% of women serving life sentences experience sexual or physical abuse before their incarceration. Many were trafficked as children. Many killed intimate partners who'd been abusing them for years. Many were convicted under accomplice liability laws for crimes committed by boyfriends or husbands who controlled them through violence. At the California Institution for Women in Corona, there's a woman named Michelle serving life without parole. She was convicted of first-degree murder in 1992. The victim was her boyfriend's drug supplier. Michelle's boyfriend owed money. He planned a robbery. He brought the gun. He pulled the trigger. But Michelle drove the car. Under California's felony murder rule, that made her equally guilty. She received the same sentence as the shooter, life without parole. She was 23 years old. She'd been with her boyfriend since she was 16. Court records documented years of domestic violence. Hospital records showed broken bones, concussions, cigarette burns. Michelle testified that she was terrified to refuse, that he'd threatened to kill her if she didn't help. The jury convicted her anyway. The judge said her fear didn't excuse her participation. Michelle is 55 now. She's been locked up for 32 years. Her boyfriend was stabbed to death in prison in 1998. She's outlived him by 26 years and counting. Women's prisons operate differently than men's facilities. There's less violence, fewer gangs, different social dynamics. But the psychological toll of life sentences hits women uniquely hard, particularly those who are mothers. At Ohio Reformatory for Women, 62% of incarcerated women are mothers. Most had custody of their children when they were arrested. Those children are now being raised by grandparents, other relatives, foster care, or the state. Women serving life sentences watch their children grow up through letters, phone calls, and visiting room windows. They miss first steps, first words, first days of school. They can't comfort their children through nightmares or breakups or grief. They become voices on phones and faces behind glass. One woman at the reformatory, serving life for a drug-related murder committed when she was 19, has 3 children she hasn't touched in 17 years. Ohio's prison allows only non-contact visits for maximum security inmates. She sees her teenagers, now 16, 18, and 20, through plexiglass. They grew from toddlers to adults while she watched from behind barriers. Her youngest daughter stopped visiting at age 12. Too painful, too confusing. The woman hasn't seen her in 4 years. She doesn't know if she ever will again. The trauma to prison pipeline for women is well documented. Studies show that girls who experience childhood sexual abuse are significantly more likely to be arrested as adults. Those who enter juvenile justice systems face higher rates of sexual assault within those facilities. Those who age out of foster care without support often end up homeless, trafficked, or in abusive relationships. By the time they commit the crime that lands them in prison for life, many women have survived horrors that would break most people. Then the system treats their survival responses, fighting back, fleeing, making desperate choices, as proof of their criminality. At Edna Mahan Correctional Facility in New Jersey, there was a woman named Madeline serving life for killing her husband. She'd endured 15 years of escalating abuse. Police had been called to their home 37 times. She had restraining orders. She'd fled to shelters twice. Each time, he found her. Each time, the violence got worse. One night, he came home drunk and beat her unconscious. When she woke up, he was asleep. She went to the kitchen, got a knife, came back, stabbed him multiple times. She called 911 herself, told them what she'd done, waited for police. The prosecutor charged first-degree murder, argued she could have left while he slept, that she wasn't in imminent danger when she killed him, that this was revenge, not self-defense. The jury convicted her. The judge sentenced her to life without parole. Madeline served 23 years before New Jersey's governor commuted her sentence in 2018. Domestic violence advocates had fought for her release for over a decade. They argued the legal system failed to understand how abuse works, how it traps women, how terror doesn't require a weapon in your face at that exact moment. But Madeline was one of the lucky ones. Thousands of women remain locked up for defending themselves against abusers, for survival crimes, for being present when someone else committed violence. The racial disparities that affect men serving life sentences affect women too, but with additional layers. Black women are incarcerated at twice the rate of white women. They receive longer sentences for the same crimes. They're less likely to receive plea deals or sentence reductions. Studies show black women are stereotyped as more violent, less feminine, less worthy of protection than white women. These biases affect every stage of criminal proceedings: arrest decisions, bail amounts, plea offers, jury verdicts, sentencing. At Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, 70% of the population is black despite black women, making up only 32% of Louisiana's female population. Among those serving life sentences, the disproportion is even starker. Healthcare in women's prisons is notoriously inadequate. Women have specific medical needs, gynecological care, mammograms, prenatal care for pregnant prisoners. Many facilities lack proper equipment or trained staff. Women report being shackled during childbirth, denied necessary procedures, having health complaints dismissed. For women serving life sentences, this means decades of inadequate care. Cervical cancers caught late. Breast tumors ignored until they're inoperable. Chronic pain treated with ibuprofen. Mental health issues managed with isolation. At Lowell Correctional Institution in Florida, the largest women's prison in the nation, investigations documented horrific conditions. Women locked in scalding showers as punishment. Tear gas used in confined spaces. Sexual abuse by guards. Medical neglect leading to preventable deaths. Women serving life sentences at Lowell had no recourse. They couldn't transfer, couldn't file effective complaints. The system knew they'd never leave, so their treatment didn't matter. The stories that haunt advocates most are the women who didn't commit any violence themselves but received life sentences anyway. In Alabama, a woman named Centoya Brown was sentenced to life for killing a man who picked her up for sex when she was 16. She'd been trafficked since age 13. The man who died had taken her to his home. She testified she feared for her life, that she grabbed his gun when he reached for something, that she shot him believing he was going to kill her. The prosecutor argued she shot him to rob him, that she was a prostitute and a criminal, not a victim. She was tried as an adult, convicted of first-degree murder, sentenced to life without parole. Centoya served 15 years before Tennessee's governor commuted her sentence in 2019. Her case had become a national cause. Celebrities advocated for her. Documentaries told her story. The governor acknowledged she'd been failed by every system meant to protect children. But how many other Centoyas are locked away without famous advocates? Without documentaries? Without governors willing to act? At the Federal Medical Center Carswell in Texas, women serving federal life sentences face a unique challenge. Federal crimes often involve conspiracy charges. If your boyfriend dealt drugs and you answered his phone once, you could be charged as part of the conspiracy. If someone in that conspiracy committed violence, you could be held liable even if you never touched a weapon. One woman at Carswell is serving life for a drug conspiracy. She was 22. Her boyfriend was a mid-level cocaine dealer. She knew about his business. Sometimes she drove him to meetings. Once she held product for him. When federal agents arrested him, they arrested her too. The boyfriend had been involved in a shooting during a deal gone wrong. Under federal conspiracy law, every member of the conspiracy is responsible for all crimes committed in furtherance of that conspiracy. She was offered a plea deal, testify against her boyfriend, get 15 years. She refused. She was terrified of him, terrified of being labeled a snitch, terrified of what would happen to her family. She went to trial. The jury convicted her of conspiracy. Because someone in the conspiracy committed murder, federal sentencing guidelines mandated life. She's been locked up for 19 years. She has a daughter she hasn't held since the child was 3. That daughter is 22 now, the same age her mother was when she went to prison. The psychology of life sentences affects women differently than men. Research shows women maintain family connections more actively. They write more letters, make more phone calls, fight harder to preserve relationships with children and parents. But those connections also cause more pain. Every missed birthday, every holiday, every milestone their children reach without them, it compounds. The guilt of not being there for their children becomes its own form of torture. At Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York, the prison runs a nursery program allowing some women to keep newborns with them for up to 18 months. Women serving life sentences watch other inmates bond with their babies, then watch those babies leave. They'll never have that chance. Even if they got pregnant before arrest, by the time they reach sentencing, any baby would be gone. Life without parole means life without ever holding your child again. One woman at Bedford Hills gave birth in county jail before her trial. She held her son for 2 hours before he was taken to her mother. That was 26 years ago. Her son is a grown man now. She knows him through photos and occasional visits. But she never got to be his mother in any real sense. The system treats women serving life sentences as if they forfeited all claims to humanity. If you killed someone, or helped kill someone, or were present when someone was killed, you don't deserve motherhood. You don't deserve health care. You don't deserve safety from abuse. You deserve a cell until you die. But the women in those cells are often survivors who made desperate choices in impossible situations. They're trafficking victims who fought back. Domestic violence survivors who finally snapped. Addicts who drove getaway cars. Girls who fell in love with dangerous men and paid for it with their lives. Sarah Cruzen's release proved something important. These women can rebuild their lives if given the chance. Since her release, she's become a powerful advocate for trafficking victims and juvenile justice reform. She's testified before Congress. She's helped change laws. But she was extraordinary in getting out. The thousands of women still inside, the Michelles, the Madelines, the Centoyas who haven't been released, they remain invisible. Nobody's making documentaries about them. Nobody's advocating for them. They're just women locked in cells, growing old, watching their children and grandchildren grow up without them. Until they die behind bars, another statistic nobody counts. When the system gets it wrong. In 1989, a man named Ricky Jackson was sentenced to death for a murder he didn't commit. The only evidence against him was the testimony of a 12-year-old boy who said he witnessed the crime. No physical evidence. No other witnesses. Just a scared child who later admitted police coerced him into lying. Ricky spent 39 years in prison, first on death row, then after Ohio abolished the death penalty, serving life without parole. He was released in 2014 when the witness recanted. At age 57, he walked out of prison having spent most of his adult life locked up for someone else's crime. He was innocent. The system destroyed his life anyway. Approximately 3,300 people have been exonerated in the United States since 1989. That's 3,300 documented cases where someone was convicted, imprisoned, and later proven innocent through DNA evidence, recanted testimony, prosecutorial misconduct being exposed, or new evidence emerging. The National Registry of Exonerations tracks these cases. The average exoneree spent 14 years in prison before release. Many spent decades. Some died before their innocence was proven. And those are just the ones who got out. How many innocent people are currently serving life sentences? How many will die in prison before anyone discovers the truth? At Angola State Penitentiary, there's a man named Glenn Ford who was sentenced to death in 1984 for murder. He maintained his innocence for 30 years. In 2014, prosecutors admitted they'd withheld evidence that would have proven he didn't commit the crime. The conviction was overturned. Glenn walked out of Angola after 3 decades on death row. He was dying of lung cancer. He lived 14 months as a free man before the disease killed him. The state of Louisiana paid him nothing for those 30 years. Under state law, he wasn't entitled to compensation because he'd had a prior felony conviction years before his wrongful murder conviction. He died broke, sick, and devastated by what the system had done to him. The causes of wrongful convictions follow predictable patterns. Eyewitness misidentification accounts for nearly 70% of convictions later overturned by DNA evidence. Human memory is unreliable. People misremember faces, especially across racial lines, especially under stress, especially when pressured by police to identify someone. False confessions account for approximately 30%. People confess to crimes they didn't commit because of coercive interrogation tactics, mental illness, intellectual disabilities, or simply because they're exhausted after hours of questioning and believe confessing will end their immediate suffering. At Illinois' Pontiac Correctional Center, a man named Juan Rivera was convicted 3 times for the same murder despite DNA evidence excluding him. He falsely confessed after 4 days of interrogation. He was 19 years old, had an IQ of 79, and was in the midst of a psychotic episode when he confessed. The confession was demonstrably false. He got basic facts about the crime wrong, but prosecutors used it anyway. Juries believed it. Judges upheld it. Rivera spent 20 years in prison before finally being released in 2011. Jailhouse informants. Inmates who testify that a defendant confessed to them in jail are another leading cause of wrongful convictions. These informants are often offered reduced sentences or other benefits in exchange for testimony. They have every incentive to lie. At California San Quentin, there have been multiple documented cases of the same jailhouse informant testifying against different defendants in different trials, always claiming the defendant confessed to him. Records later showed some of these defendants were never even housed near the informant. But juries believe these witnesses. A fellow inmate has nothing to gain by lying, they think. Prosecutors present them as reluctant witnesses just doing their civic duty. The reality is they're trading testimony for freedom. They'll say whatever prosecutors want them to say. Forensic science fraud and error account for a significant percentage of wrongful convictions. Bite mark analysis has been thoroughly discredited but was used in hundreds of convictions. Arson investigation techniques, once considered scientific, have been proven unreliable. Hair microscopy, fiber analysis, even fingerprinting have error rates higher than the public realizes. In Mississippi, a man named Kennedy Brewer was convicted of murder based largely on bite mark evidence. A forensic odontologist testified that marks on the victim matched Brewer's teeth. He was sentenced to death. Years later, DNA evidence proved another man committed the crime. That man confessed. The bite mark evidence was completely wrong. Kennedy Brewer was released after 15 years, 7 of them on death row. The expert who testified against him, he continued working as a forensic odontologist, testifying in other cases. Prosecutorial misconduct. hiding exculpatory evidence, presenting false testimony, making improper arguments, causes wrongful convictions that are particularly hard to overturn. Brady violations, where prosecutors fail to disclose evidence favorable to the defense, happen in case after case. At Texas's Beto unit, Michael Morton served 25 years for his wife's murder before DNA evidence proved another man killed her. Prosecutors had hidden evidence pointing to that other suspect. They'd hidden evidence that the couple's 3-year-old son witnessed the crime and said his father wasn't there. They'd hidden evidence of a suspicious man in the neighborhood. Morton lost 25 years. His son grew up believing his father murdered his mother. The prosecutor who hid the evidence was later found in contempt of court and served 5 days in jail. 5 days for stealing 25 years of a man's life. Inadequate defense is another factor. Public defenders are overwhelmed with impossible caseloads. Some handle hundreds of cases simultaneously. They lack resources for investigation, expert witnesses, testing. Many defendants get lawyers who meet them for the first time minutes before trial. At Louisiana State Penitentiary, there are men serving life sentences who had lawyers who presented no defense, called no witnesses, conducted no investigation. The entire trial lasted hours. The lawyer never visited the crime scene, never interviewed alibi witnesses, never challenged the state's evidence. That's not a defense. That's a formality before imprisonment. The appeals process theoretically catches these errors. But appeals are expensive, time-consuming, and difficult. Most convictions are upheld regardless of problems in the original trial. Courts defer to jury verdicts. They say even if errors occurred, the defendant hasn't proven those errors affected the outcome. The actual innocence standard is incredibly high. You don't just need to show reasonable doubt. You need to prove conclusively you didn't do it. DNA evidence helps, but most crimes don't leave DNA. Recanted testimony helps, but courts are skeptical of recantations. New evidence helps, but you have strict deadlines for presenting it. At California's Corcoran State Prison, a man named Kevin Cooper has been on death row since 1985 for a quadruple murder. He's maintained his innocence for 39 years. Multiple judges have found problems with his trial, evidence that may have been planted, Brady violations, racial bias in jury selection, prosecutorial misconduct. But he's still there, still on death row, still fighting. Because the standard for proving innocence after conviction is almost impossibly high. The racial disparities in wrongful convictions are extreme. Black people account for 53% of exonerations, despite being 13% of the population. Black defendants convicted of murder are 50% more likely to be innocent than other convicted murderers. Part of this reflects racial bias in eyewitness identification. People are worse at identifying faces of other races. Part reflects heavier policing in Black communities, leading to more arrests. Part reflects implicit bias among police, prosecutors, judges, and juries. At Louisiana's Angola, a significant percentage of the men serving life sentences have claims of innocence. Some have evidence supporting those claims. Most will never get hearings, never get DNA testing, never get their cases reviewed. They'll die insisting they're innocent. And some of them will be telling the truth. The psychological toll of wrongful conviction is catastrophic. You know you're innocent. Everyone tells you you're lying. Your family believes in you at first, but as years pass, some start to doubt. You watch guilty people get paroled while you stay locked up because you won't admit to a crime you didn't commit. You lose everything. Your youth, your family, your sanity. You develop prison trauma while simultaneously carrying the trauma of being punished for something you didn't do. Then if you finally get exonerated, if you're one of the lucky ones, you're released with nothing. No money, no support, no compensation in many states. Just a bus ticket and the expectation that you'll figure out how to rebuild a life that was stolen from you. Maurice Hastings spent 38 years in a California prison for a murder he didn't commit. DNA evidence finally exonerated him in 2022. He was 69 years old. He'd spent more than half his life locked up. California gave him $140 per day of wrongful incarceration, about $1.9 million total. That sounds like a lot until you realize it's $50,000 per year for nearly 4 decades of stolen life. No amount of money returns those years. No amount returns his youth, his mother who died while he was inside, the life he could have lived. And Maurice is lucky. Many states cap compensation at much lower amounts. Some states offer nothing at all. Oklahoma requires exonerees to prove they didn't commit any crime that contributed to their conviction, an impossible standard. Montana capped compensation at $60,000 total regardless of how long you were imprisoned. The victims of the actual crimes also suffer when a wrong person is convicted. The real perpetrator remains free. They often commit more crimes, creating more victims. Justice isn't served by imprisoning innocent people. At Illinois Stateville Prison, there were dozens of men convicted based on confessions tortured out of them by Chicago Police Commander John Burge and his officers. They used electric shock, suffocation, mock executions. Over 100 people were tortured. Many confessed to crimes they didn't commit. Many were convicted and sentenced to death or life without parole. It took decades to expose what happened. Burge was eventually convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice, not torture, because the statute of limitations had expired. He served 3.5 years in federal prison. The men he tortured, some have been exonerated and released. Many remain locked up, still fighting, still trying to prove their innocence despite overwhelming evidence of torture. The system resists admitting mistakes. Prosecutors who secured convictions don't want them overturned. It makes them look bad, threatens their conviction rates, opens them to criticism. Judges who upheld convictions don't want to admit they were wrong. Police who investigated cases don't want their work questioned. So innocent people stay locked up. They file appeals that get denied. They seek DNA testing that gets refused. They present new evidence that gets ignored. They point to witnesses who've recanted, experts who've retracted evidence that was hidden. And the system says the jury heard the evidence. The jury decided. That's final. Even when that decision was based on lies, coerced confessions, junk science, hidden evidence, and racism. Ricky Jackson, the man who spent 39 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit, said something haunting after his release. The worst part wasn't being in prison. The worst part was knowing I was innocent and watching everyone treat me like I was lying. That's the true horror of wrongful conviction. Not just the stolen years. The destroyed belief that truth matters. That justice exists. That the system works. For the innocent people still locked up, serving life sentences, that horror continues every day. They know they didn't do it. They know the system doesn't care. And they know they'll probably die in prison anyway. The lifers who give back. At San Quentin State Prison, there's a program called The Last Mile. It teaches prisoners computer coding, web development, entrepreneurship. The students are mostly lifers. Men serving sentences that will likely end in death. They sit in a classroom surrounded by concrete and razor wire, learning skills for jobs they'll probably never have, building websites they'll never see outside prison servers, planning businesses they'll never run. But they do it anyway. One of the instructors is a man named Chris Schumacher. He's serving 15 years to life for second-degree murder. He committed the crime at 19 during a drug deal gone wrong. He's 43 now. He's been denied parole 3 times. Chris runs the coding program. He's taught hundreds of inmates skills that help them succeed on release. He mentors younger prisoners, helps them avoid the mistakes he made, gives them hope even though his own release remains uncertain. When asked why he does it, knowing he might die inside, Chris said something that captures what happens to many lifers. If I can't get out and contribute to society, I can at least contribute to the people in here who will get out. This is the paradox of life sentences. They're designed to warehouse people permanently, to remove them from society, to say, you are beyond redemption, beyond value, beyond hope. But human beings refuse to become what the system says they are. At Angola State Penitentiary, the hospice program run by lifers has become nationally recognized. These men, serving life for murder, armed robbery, violent crimes, care for dying prisoners with remarkable compassion. They bathe them, feed them, hold their hands in final moments, provide comfort the state would never pay for. One hospice volunteer described sitting with a man who'd been his enemy for 20 years. They were from rival groups, had fought each other, hated each other. But when that man was dying of cancer, too weak to feed himself, the volunteer sat with him every day for 6 weeks. Fed him, read to him, prayed with him. In here, we're all we've got, the volunteer said. When you're dying, none of that other stuff matters. At California State Prison, Los Angeles County, there's a program called Veterans Healing Veterans. It's run by prisoners who served in the military before their crimes. They provide peer counseling to other veteran inmates struggling with PTSD, addiction, the trauma that often leads to incarceration. Most of the counselors are lifers. They'll never leave, but they've created something meaningful within the walls. They've reduced suicide rates, helped men process combat trauma, given purpose to people the system has discarded. The research on prison programs run by lifers shows something surprising. When long-term prisoners are given responsibility, autonomy, and purpose, they create remarkable things. Educational programs, mental health support, conflict resolution systems. They become the backbone of rehabilitation efforts, even for people who won't be rehabilitated in society's eyes because they'll never be released. At Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois, there's a program where lifers serve as mentors to younger prisoners. They teach prison survival skills, help navigate institutional bureaucracy, discourage gang involvement. The recidivism rate for prisoners who complete this mentorship program is significantly lower than average. The mentors get nothing from it. No time off their sentences, no parole points, just the satisfaction of knowing they helped someone avoid dying in prison like they will. One mentor, serving life without parole for a murder committed at 23, has mentored over 40 younger prisoners during his 28 years inside. He's watched them get released, get jobs, start families, build lives he'll never have. I can't save myself, he said, but maybe I can save some of them. The college degree programs in prisons produce similar results. Prisoners serving life sentences earn bachelor's degrees, sometimes master's degrees. They'll never use those degrees outside prison, but they tutor other inmates. They create study groups. They transform the culture of their units from violent to academic. At Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York, women serving life sentences have earned college degrees and now teach courses to other inmates. One woman, serving life for murder, has taught over 200 women basic literacy. Another runs a parenting program, teaching young mothers how to maintain relationships with their children despite incarceration. These women will likely die in prison, but they've created something that will outlive them, a culture of education and support that helps others survive. The religious programs in prisons often run similarly. Lifers become chaplains, ministers, spiritual counselors. They lead worship services, provide counseling, create communities of faith within the walls. At Louisiana State Penitentiary, the prison holds an annual rodeo. It's controversial. Critics say it exploits prisoners, but the prisoners who run it, mostly lifers, describe it differently. They say it gives them purpose, a chance to raise money for programs, a way to interact with the outside world, even briefly. One lifer who's worked the rodeo for 18 years said, "For 1 week in a year, people see us as human beings instead of numbers. That matters." The art created by lifers fills museums outside prison walls. Paintings, sculptures, writing, music. San Quentin has produced published authors, exhibited artists, musicians who've recorded albums. Jarvis J. Masters, on San Quentin's death row for nearly 40 years, has written multiple books from his cell. He's a Buddhist teacher, a mentor to other prisoners, a voice for criminal justice reform. His writing has touched hundreds of thousands of people. He'll probably die on death row, but his work lives outside those walls in ways he never will. The policy question that haunts reformers is this: if people can transform this dramatically, if they can give back this meaningfully even within prison, why do we insist they must die there? Some argue that's exactly the point. The punishment isn't just incarceration, it's permanent removal from society regardless of who you become. The sentence reflects the seriousness of the crime, not the potential of the person. Others argue it's wasteful and cruel, that we're throwing away human potential, that someone who spent 30 years helping others, teaching, counseling, caring for the dying has paid their debt, and then some. The victims' families remain divided. Some find peace in knowing the person who killed their loved one will never be free. Others have met the prisoners, seen their transformation, and advocated for their release. Some have forgiven. Others never will. There's no easy answer. The crimes were real. The harm was real. The grief never ends for families of victims. But the transformations are also real. The contributions are real. The humanity is real. At Ohio's Marion Correctional Institution, there's a program where prisoners train service dogs for disabled veterans. The trainers are mostly lifers. They spend months working with each dog, teaching commands, socializing them, preparing them for their future roles. Then they have to give the dogs away. Watch them go to veterans who need them. Never see them again. One trainer, serving life for murder, said the hardest part is the goodbye. You pour everything into these dogs. You love them. Then they leave and you start over with another one. It's like giving away pieces of your heart over and over. But he keeps doing it. He's trained 17 dogs in 8 years. 17 disabled veterans have better lives because of his work. Work he does from Cell Hill, probably die in. This is what life without parole looks like when you look past the sentence and see the people. It's men and women who committed terrible crimes, real crimes that caused real harm, and then spent decades becoming something different. It's reading to the dying, teaching others to read, training service dogs, coding websites, earning degrees, writing books, mentoring the next generation, creating beauty and meaning and purpose in the most hopeless circumstances imaginable. The system says these people have no value, no future, no hope. The people themselves keep proving the system wrong. 56,000 people are serving life without parole in America right now. They will die behind bars unless laws change, governors grant clemency, or courts overturn convictions. Some absolutely belong there. They're dangerous, predatory, incapable of functioning safely in society. The justice system got it right. But others, how many others, have transformed completely? Have spent decades atoning, helping, teaching, caring for people the system has forgotten? How many Charles Duttons are locked away who could contribute to society if given the chance? How many innocent people are dying in cells for crimes they didn't commit? How many teenagers sentenced to die in prison for mistakes made at 16 are now 60-year-old men who bear no resemblance to who they were? The data suggests life without parole doesn't make us safer. Crime rates haven't dropped because of these sentences. States with the most life sentences don't have less crime than states with fewer. The billions spent warehousing aging prisoners could fund prevention, treatment, education, things that actually reduce crime. But changing these policies requires political courage, admitting we were wrong, risking the criticism that comes with being called soft on crime. So the sentences continue. The prisons fill with elderly men shuffling to medical appointments. The hospice programs run by prisoners caring for other prisoners expand. The cemeteries behind razor wire keep growing. And 56,000 people wake up every morning knowing they will die exactly where they are. Some were juveniles when sentenced. Some are innocent. Some committed terrible crimes and became completely different people. Some probably do belong in prison forever. The question we refuse to ask is, how do we tell the difference? How do we identify the Charles Duttons, the wrongfully convicted, the reformed, the transformed, and separate them from the truly dangerous? The current answer is, we don't try. Life means life. It doesn't matter who you become. It only matters what you did. Ricky Jackson spent 39 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. Glenn Ford spent 30 years on death row before being exonerated months before cancer killed him. Kenneth Young arrived at Angola at 16 and will die there despite decades of rehabilitation. Sarah Cruzen killed her trafficker at 16 and spent 19 years in prison before advocates fought for her release. Chris Schumacher teaches coding to other prisoners while serving 15 to life with multiple parole denials. Jarvis J. Masters writes books from death row that inspire thousands. These are the stories that will haunt you, not because they're exceptional, but because they're not. These stories repeat 56,000 times over with different names, different crimes, different details. But the same ending: concrete walls and steel bars until death. The question isn't whether punishment is deserved. The question is whether permanent human warehousing serves any purpose beyond retribution. Whether transformation should matter. Whether anyone deserves a second chance after taking someone else's only chance. Those are questions America hasn't answered honestly. So the default remains: lock them up and forget they exist. But they do exist. They're teaching, learning, caring, creating, mentoring, transforming. They're aging, dying, being buried in prison cemeteries. They're fathers and mothers and sons and daughters who made terrible mistakes or were convicted wrongly or committed real crimes and became different people. 56,000 people. 56,000 life stories that end the same way. Behind walls. Behind wire. Behind bars. Forever. If this story made you think, drop a comment with your perspective. Do people serving life sentences deserve a chance at redemption? Or does life mean life, regardless of transformation? There's no easy answer, but the conversation matters. If you want to understand more about America's criminal justice system, check out our next video on death row, where the state decides who lives and who dies, and the mistakes that haunt the system forever. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who needs to understand what life without parole really means. Thanks for watching.